The smell of sweet, cloying gas was the first thing that hit Evelyn as she stepped into her darkened office, thick enough to taste on the back of her tongue. In the center of her desk, a single ivory-handled hunting knife was buried deep into the wood, pinning a scrap of paper that read only 3 words: "Stop or burn." Outside, the engine of a black sedan purred in the shadows, its headlights unlit like the eyes of a predator waiting for a single spark to turn the building into a funeral pyre. She reached for the light switch, her finger hovering inches from the plastic toggle, before the realization of the trap turned her blood to ice. Through the window, the gray dust of Blackwood Creek swirled in the wind, coating the silent streets in what looked like industrial ash. Somewhere in the archives, the history of this town was being shredded. And as the heavy thrum of the idling car outside grew louder, Evelyn realized she wasn't just chasing a story. She was standing in a room full of poison, holding the only evidence that could save a city already marked for death. The soles of Evelyn Sharpe's heavy boots crunched through a thick layer of gray sediment that blanketed the sidewalks of Blackwood Creek. This wasn't ordinary dust. It was the calcified remains of a town's lungs, a fine powder that seemed to fall from the very sky. A biting Pennsylvania wind chased empty tin cans across the cracked asphalt, their hollow rattling echoing off the plywood-covered windows of former haberdasheries and storefronts that hadn't seen a customer in a decade. Evelyn raised her camera, the cold metal biting into her cheek as she peered through the viewfinder. She focused on the city hall, framing the streaks of rust that bled down the facade like weeping sores. The air tasted of sulfur and stagnant dampness, a flavor she had grown to loathe yet couldn't escape. Stepping back into the middle of the street, she aimed at the old theater. The marquee was a row of empty sockets where neon letters had long ago shattered or fallen away, leaving behind a skeletal frame that spelled out nothing. Her fingers were numb, stiffening in the chill, but she continued to press the shutter button with methodical precision. She was documenting an autopsy, capturing the slow agony of a place turning into a ghost under a permanent canopy of smog. Inside the editorial office of the Valley Voice, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of decaying newsprint and dregs of cold coffee. Evelyn tossed her keys onto a desk, buried under a landslide of proof sheets and unanswered mail. She froze. Resting next to her flickering monitor sat a package wrapped in heavy craft paper. It possessed no stamps, no postmarks from the USPS, and certainly no return address. She reached out, tracing the rough texture of the paper with her fingertips, feeling the sharp, unyielding edges of a folder hidden within. The office was unnervingly silent. The only sound the rhythmic, low-frequency thrum of an ancient refrigerator in the corner. She glanced over her shoulder at the empty workstations of her remaining staff, a sudden chill prickling the skin on the back of her neck. The object felt like a foreign organ transplanted into her familiar chaos, radiating a silent, heavy threat that made the very air in the room feel pressurized. Evelyn drove a letter opener into the thick paper, ripping the envelope open with a jagged stroke. A cascade of blue technical blueprints and spreadsheets filled with chemical indices spilled across the scarred wood of her desk. Her eyes darted over the headers, searching for the promised green meadows and playgrounds of the Eco Park project the city council had touted for months. Instead, the diagrams revealed massive concrete containment vessels and complex industrial filtration systems designed for heavy sludge. Her breath hitched when she spotted a stamp marked Hazardous Class 1, positioned directly over the foundation plans for the lower settlement. Her palms grew damp instantly, leaving dark, translucent stains on the glossy surface of the documents. A soft, involuntary whistle escaped her teeth. The calculated capacity for this toxic waste terminal was staggering. It was enough to transform the entire valley into a dead zone in less than a season. Evelyn pressed the telephone receiver against her ear, counting the long, hollow pulses of the dial tone. When the mayor's press secretary finally answered, Evelyn didn't lead with pleasantries. She recited the specific registration case number from the blueprints in a flat, clinical tone. A heavy, suffocating silence hung on the other end of the line before erupting into a jagged, defensive shout. The official accused her of possessing stolen confidential property and threatened immediate legal retaliation that would bury her in the paper. Evelyn tried to interject, to ask about the discrepancy in the public zoning. But the line went dead with a series of sharp, rhythmic pips. She dialed the Department of Environmental Protection next. But the moment she identified herself, the person on the other end hung up without a word. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the handset, the realization sinking in that the city officials weren't just avoiding her. They were paralyzed by a desperate, frantic need to ensure she remained silent. Evelyn stepped out of her car in front of the massive, iron-studded doors of the city archives, pulling her coat tight against the damp Pennsylvania chill. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught the silhouette of a black sedan with deep-tinted windows idling across the street. The engine hummed, spitting thin plumes of blue-gray exhaust into the air. She slowed her pace, faking a search through her bag for a non-existent set of keys. The driver's side window slid down an inch, revealing the sharp profile of a man wearing dark glasses, his face a motionless mask of indifference. The fine hairs on her neck stood up. As she pulled the heavy oak door of the archive open, the sound of a car door slamming shut echoed down the empty block behind her, a clear signal that her shadow had no intention of being subtle. The interior of the archive smelled of dust, mothballs, and the slow fermentation of paper. Evelyn flipped through a heavy land registry ledger, her finger tracing the lines of ownership like a tracker following a trail. When she reached the section dedicated to the lower settlement, her heart lunged against her ribs. Between pages 412 and 450, there was nothing but jagged, translucent paper stubs. She lifted the ledger toward the light, spotting the tacky, fresh residue of glue along the spine. Turning to the checkout log, she saw a glaringly empty line next to last Friday's date. She approached the elderly archivist, but the woman refused to meet her gaze, her hands shaking as she began to frantically reorganize a stack of folders that were already neat. Evelyn understood then. Someone had been here a week ago, surgically removing the history of the land transfer, erasing the paper trail of a crime before she could even find the starting line. Evelyn shoved the door to the editorial office open and stopped dead on the threshold. A thick, sweet, cloying scent hit her. Natural gas. She instinctively pulled the sleeve of her coat over her mouth and nose, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. In the dim light filtering from the street, she saw the knob on the old stove in the break room turned to its maximum setting. There was no flame, just the invisible, heavy flow of poison filling the room. She lunged toward the window, her mind screaming a warning not to touch a light switch or use her phone. Her eyes began to sting, a sharp tickle developing in the back of her throat. She moved by memory and touch, avoiding anything metal that might strike a spark, fully aware that the valley voice was one static discharge away from becoming an inferno with her at its center. She reached the valve and twisted it with a violent, desperate wrench, cutting the flow of gas. Evelyn threw the windows wide, letting the freezing night air rush in to tear apart the veil of toxic fumes. She leaned heavily against a desk, her knees trembling so hard she feared they would buckle. Her gaze drifted to the wall beside the door. There, pinned directly over the office calendar, an ivory-handled hunting knife was buried deep into the plaster. The blade held a scrap of paper in place. Evelyn stepped closer, her eyes watering as she read 3 words scrawled in thick, black marker. Stop or burn. She reached toward the handle of the knife, then pulled her hand back, watching the steel glint with a dull, predatory light in the pale moonbeams. The abandoned railway depot greeted Evelyn with the screech of rusted iron gates. Deep within the cavernous workshop, amidst the skeletal remains of freight cars, her informant, Barney, stood waiting. He was a nervous wreck, chain-smoking and flinching at every shadow cast by the moonlight. When she approached, he grabbed her elbow with a grip that bruised, whispering in a frantic, ragged tone. He claimed the signatures on the terminal documents didn't just belong to the developers. The mayor and the sheriff were on the take, too. Barney's voice cracked as he described seeing lists of offshore accounts and kickbacks, detailing how the city's elite had sold the health of the valley for a retirement fund. A siren wailed in the distance, and Barney vanished into the darkness of the depot instantly, leaving Evelyn standing alone in the silence of the rusted ruins. Morning arrived with a leaden sky and a heavy silence in the yard. Evelyn walked toward her car and stopped, seeing the vehicle sagging unnaturally toward the pavement. All four tires had been reduced to ribbons of black rubber, shredded by deep, surgical cuts. She circled the car, finding a single, clear, muddy boot print on the hood, a deliberate signature of intrusion. This wasn't the work of bored vandals. It was a professional warning delivered to her doorstep. She looked up at the windows of the neighboring houses, but the curtains remained closed and still. They knew where she slept, they knew her schedule, and they knew how to ground her. The sensation of an invisible noose tightening around her neck became a physical weight, making her grip her keys until the metal bit into her palm. Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, the space illuminated by a single, harsh bulb that cast long shadows across the room. Spread before her were the leaked blueprints, satellite imagery, and geological maps of the valley's water table. She traced the corporate seal of Global Resources and found the exact same emblem on the foundation plans for the toxic terminal. Using a red pen, she drew lines on the map. The toxic runoff wouldn't just sit in the soil, it would drain directly into the Blackwood Creek Reservoir. The wall clock struck 3 in the morning, but her mind was racing too fast for sleep. A horrific mosaic was forming. Thousands of families would be drinking lead and mercury while the men in the city hall counted their dividends. She pressed her palms against her temples, the sheer scale of the betrayal making her feel small and dangerously exposed. Evelyn's phone vibrated on the kitchen table, the sudden movement causing her cold tea to ripple. The screen displayed the name Marcus Reed. When she answered, a smooth, calculated baritone filled her ear, a voice that carried the phantom scent of expensive tobacco and silk. Marcus didn't waste time. He invited her to the Golden Anchor, a private yacht club on the edge of the river. His tone was unnervingly gentle, speaking of the need to discuss civic stability in a private setting. She felt a cold sweat break across her shoulders while he dictated the time. Her own heavy breathing seemed to drown out the ticking of the clock, turning the quiet of her kitchen into a staging ground for a confrontation she had dreaded for years. Evelyn sorted through a box of yellowed photographs in the paper's morgue, where the air was thick with the smell of old fixer and damp cardboard. Her fingers snagged on a glossy print with scalloped edges. It was 20 years old. A younger, unlined Marcus Reed stood next to a teenage Evelyn. They were standing on a barren patch of land in the lower settlement, triumphantly thrusting a silver shovel into the dirt for a community garden project. In the background were the very hills where the terminal was now slated to rise. She stared at Marcus's smile. In the light of the present, it looked less like youthful ambition and more like a predator's grin. Her heart skipped a beat. She realized then that this land had been in Marcus's sights since they were children, a long-game betrayal that made her stomach turn. She walked along the embankment where the salt spray stung her cheeks, carrying the rot of the river. Two figures stepped out from the shadow of a massive dock crane, blocking her path. Their faces were obscured by black knit masks, leaving only their eyes to glint with a frantic, desperate light under the flickering street lamps. One man lunged, his hand snapping out to snag the leather strap of her satchel. Evelyn felt a violent jerk that sent a flare of white-hot pain through her shoulder. The men's boots grated against the gravel, shoving her back toward the edge of the stone parapet. She gripped the strap with everything she had, feeling the hard edges of the toxic terminal files through the leather. They were breathing in her face now, a hot, sour smell of adrenaline and malice. Evelyn reached into the side pocket of her bag and whipped out her heavy aluminum tripod. The metal whistled through the air, connecting with the first man's forearm with a sickening, dull thud. He let out a muffled yelp of pain, his grip slackening. She didn't wait for a second attempt. She bolted toward a narrow, pitch-black gap between two warehouses. Her boots slipped on the slick, mossy cobblestones, her heart thumping against her ribs like a panicked animal. She pressed herself into a brick wall that smelled of wet soot and ancient grease, holding the folders against her chest as if they were her own heart. She stayed there, paralyzed, listening as the heavy footsteps of the men faded into the distance, replaced only by the rhythmic slap of the tide against the pier and the sound of her own ragged, sobbing gasps for air. A tall figure stepped out of the darkness at the end of the alley. A flashlight beam cut through the gloom, blinding her. It was Marcus. He didn't call for the police or shout for help. Instead, he reached out and took her by the elbow, his hand feeling like a band of ice even through her heavy coat. He led her toward the side entrance of the yacht club. Inside his private office, the air was heavy with the scent of beeswax and high-end bourbon. He pushed a glass of water toward her, the ice cubes clinking against the crystal. Evelyn stared at the trembling surface of the liquid, feeling Marcus's performative concern wrap around her like a suffocating shroud. He sat there, watching her with a calm, predatory patience that was far more terrifying than the men on the docks. Marcus unbuttoned his suit jacket and leaned forward, his long fingers interlaced on the desk. In a voice as smooth as velvet, he explained that the terminal was his masterpiece, the only thing that would keep Blackwood Creek on the map. He slid a rectangular slip of paper across the polished wood. Evelyn looked down at a bank check with a number that made her head swim. 6 zeros. It was a promise of new presses, a renovated building, and a legacy of comfort for the Valley Voice. He nudged the check closer, the tip of his gold pen resting on the grain of the desk. His eyes remained as cold as a winter lake, waiting for her to break, offering to buy her integrity with the very funds that would poison the people she was trying to protect. Marcus stood and began to pace the room, his shadow stretching across the leather-bound books on the shelves. He spoke of Blackwood Creek as if it were a terminal patient, a body whose veins were clogged with rust and stagnation. Evelyn listened, her jaw tight, as he called the toxic dump an injection of capital, and described global resources as the only surgeon brave enough to operate. His cynicism was a palpable thing, a greasy film over every word, as he argued that environmentalism was a luxury for people who didn't have to worry about their next meal. A wave of nausea rolled over her. He was sentencing the entire valley to a slow, agonizing death, and he was doing it with a smile and a well-tailored suit. Evelyn snatched the check from the desk and crumpled it, hurling it straight at Marcus's face. The paper clipped his cheek before fluttering to the rug like a dead moth. She turned and sprinted out of the office, ignoring his icy command to stop. In the hallway, the sheriff was leaning against the wood paneling, his massive frame blocking the exit. He didn't move, just stood there thumbing the leather strap of his holster with a slow, rhythmic click. His silver badge caught the light of the wall sconces, a dull, mocking glint. Evelyn shoved past him, her skin crawling from the sheer weight of his stare. She felt his eyes on her back all the way to the heavy front doors, a focused, unblinking threat that followed her out into the night. She emerged onto the main square, where the roar of a crowd drowned out the fountain. Marcus was already there, having beaten her somehow, standing on a temporary stage and radiating a manufactured, glowing warmth into a microphone. The people of Blackwood Creek, dressed in their Sunday best and work jackets, cheered and whistled. Marcus pointed to vibrant posters of the Eco Park, promising thousands of jobs and a tax base that would save their schools. Evelyn watched the faces of the townspeople, seeing a desperate, starving hope ignite in their eyes. The applause grew into a rhythmic, deafening thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the buildings. She stood on the periphery, watching Marcus conduct the crowd like an orchestra, feeding them a beautifully packaged lie. Evelyn tried to push through the throng toward a group of men in construction vests from the lower settlement. She grabbed one by the arm, her voice cracking as she tried to tell him about the blueprints and the mercury. The man yanked his arm back as if she were a leper. He spat a curse at her, calling her a city-bred vulture who wanted to keep them poor just so she'd have something to write about. The other workers closed ranks, forming a wall of denim and flannel that shut her out. Harsher jeers followed, telling her to take her fake news and get out of their town. She saw the fear in their eyes, a deep, primal terror of losing this one last chance at a paycheck, and realized Marcus had weaponized their desperation against her. Evelyn looked toward the horizon where the main road entered the valley. A thick cloud of orange dust was rising. A convoy of massive bulldozers and tankers, all bearing the Global Resources logo, was crawling toward the town. Their steel blades caught the sun like the teeth of a predator. Around the perimeter of the lower settlement, men in black tactical gear were already dismounting from transport vans. She could hear the low, bone-shaking thrum of the diesel engines as they neared. The private security teams began unloading rolls of concertina wire, starting the methodical process of walling off the residential streets. The siege had begun, and the iron ring was closing around the town faster than she could ever hope to stop it. Evelyn yanked on the handles of the city print shop, but the heavy chains wrapped around the iron pulls only gave a dull, mocking clank. Through the glass, she saw two deputies sitting on stacks of newsprint in the lobby, casually playing cards. One of them tapped his holster when he saw her face, a slow, deliberate warning. The scent of ink still clung to the building, but the presses were silent, held hostage by the council's order. The guard spat on the floor and stood up, his boots echoing as he walked toward the door to stare her down. She backed away into the shadows of the alley, the sound of his rhythmic pacing a reminder that the traditional channels of truth had been surgically severed. She retreated to the basement of the old archive, a place where the air was a tomb of damp earth and rot. Her flashlight beam cut through the dark, landing on a bulky shape draped in gray canvas. She ripped the fabric away, coughing as a century of dust exploded into the air. Beneath it sat a Columbia hand press, a cast-iron beast from the 1800s. She ran her hand over the cold, ornate frame, feeling the raised eagles cast into the metal. The flywheel was seized with old grease, but it was solid. She found a tin of black ink and felt a surge of adrenaline. Under the grime and the neglect, the ancient heart of the press was still there, waiting for someone with enough desperation to make it breathe again. Evelyn leaned over the type cases, her fingers dancing over the lead slugs that shimmered in the dim light. Her fingertips were soon stained gray and crisscrossed with tiny, stinging nicks as she plucked the sharp letters from their cubbies. She laid them into the composing stick one by one, her mind focused on the mirrored reality of the text. The metal was frigid, and the burrs on the letters M, A, R, C, U, and S drew beads of blood that smeared onto the type. She didn't feel the pain. She only heard the metallic click of each letter locking into place, a rhythmic, tiny hammer strike against the conspiracy. In the silence of the cellar, the only sounds were her shallow breathing and the leaden heartbeat of the truth being set in stone. She threw her entire weight against the heavy flywheel, forcing the rusted gears to give a long, agonized shriek. The ink roller, thick with tacky black paste, moved across the lead type with a wet, squelching sound. She placed a sheet of coarse paper onto the platen and pulled the lever. The mechanism hit with a dull, heavy thud. By the light of a flickering kerosene lamp, she peeled the paper back. The black ink was embossed deep into the fibers, creating a jagged, undeniable record of the terminal's true purpose. Sweat stung her eyes, and her shoulders screamed from the effort. But she kept turning the wheel. The stack of flyers grew, filling the basement with the sharp, electric smell of fresh ink and her own quiet, focused rage. Evelyn wrapped the bundles of flyers around her torso, securing them with silver duct tape until the paper crinkled with every breath. She pulled on an oversized coat, the stiff bundles making her movements awkward and robotic. She stepped out onto Main Street, into a world transformed. Blue Global Resources flags snapped in the wind, and a brass band was playing a manic, upbeat march. The crowd was thick, people clutching free sodas and cheering for the very men who were poisoning them. She felt the sharp edges of the paper digging into her ribs as she walked. A pair of deputies strolled past, their eyes scanning the crowd for trouble. She ducked her head, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the hidden layers of forbidden truth strapped to her skin. In the center of the square, Evelyn collided with Marcus's mother. The old woman, dressed in a delicate felt beret, reached out and gripped Evelyn's arms. Her hands were paper-thin and shaking, her eyes wet with a confusing mix of pride and nostalgia. She whispered a thank you, talking about how she remembered Evelyn and Marcus playing in the dirt of the lower settlement as kids. Evelyn felt the warmth of the woman's palms and the crushing weight of the flyers against her stomach. Mary pressed her cheek against Evelyn's shoulder, a gesture of motherly love that felt like a hot iron. Evelyn stood frozen, unable to return the embrace, her body a cage for the very documents that would destroy this woman's world. Evelyn looked up at the stone ledge of the city hall and saw a brief, metallic flash. A sniper in a camouflage jacket was positioned behind the balustrade, his rifle barrel a dark finger pointing into the crowd. She spotted another observer near the clock tower, binoculars fixed on the square. The police officers on the ground had their hands resting near their belts, their radios chirping with clipped, professional commands. The square wasn't a festival. It was a kill zone. She realized that any attempt to distribute the flyers would be met with immediate, lethal force. A cold trickle of sweat ran down her spine as she understood that Marcus hadn't just invited the town to a party. He had invited them to witness a demonstration of total control. Evelyn began to shove through the crowd, using her shoulders to wedge through the gaps between people. She ignored the angry grunts and the smell of fried dough and cheap cologne that threatened to choke her. The stage loomed ahead, a sea of red velvet and polished wood. Marcus was there, adjusting the microphone with a practiced, effortless grace. His face, projected 40 feet high on the digital screens, was a mask of perfect, untroubled leadership. She saw him take a sip of water, his throat moving in a slow, confident swallow. She was only yards away now, the vibration from the massive speakers rattling the paper strapped to her chest. She made a final, desperate lunge for the edge of the stairs. A massive hand slammed into her chest, stopping her dead. It was the sheriff. He planted his boots and shoved her back against the steel security railing with enough force to knock the wind out of her. She heard the distinct, heavy click of a leather holster strap being flicked open. The sheriff's face was inches from hers, smelling of stale wintergreen and tobacco. He didn't say a word, just stared at her with eyes like slate, his hand hovering over the grip of his sidearm. The cold metal of the railing bit into her spine. She watched his fingers twitch toward the weapon, while the crowd behind her erupted into a roar of approval for the man on the stage, a sound that drowned out the grinding of her own teeth. Marcus looked down from the podium, his gaze landing on the struggle between the sheriff and Evelyn. For a split second, the mask slipped, and she saw a flicker of genuine panic in his eyes. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a look of magnanimous pity. He raised a hand to quiet the crowd and pointed toward her. Following a silent command, the sheriff reluctantly stepped back, his hand still resting on his belt. Marcus announced into the microphone that Blackwood Creek was a bastion of the First Amendment and invited his oldest friend to join him on the stage. The crowd parted like a dark sea, forming a corridor of suspicious eyes that led straight to the man who had sold them out. Evelyn climbed the wooden steps, each footfall echoing through the PA system like a gunshot. On the stage, the wind whipped her hair across her face, and the heat of the spotlights felt like a physical weight. She looked out at the sea of faces, the hopeful workers, the scared mothers, the men who had already been bought. The air felt thin and electric. She saw Barney in the front row, twisting his cap in his hands, and she realized that one wrong word would turn this square into a riot that the snipers on the roof were waiting to end. She approached the microphone stand, her hand trembling as she reached for the cold, vibrating stem of the device. She stood before the crowd, the low hum of the speakers vibrating in her marrow. Instead of speaking, she reached under her coat. The sound of duct tape tearing was a sharp, violent rip in the silence. She pulled the original blueprints and the chemical logs from her torso, the blue and white sheets fluttering in the wind. The glossy paper caught the glare of the spotlights, flashing like a beacon. She held them high above her head, showing the global resources seals to the front rows. She didn't say a word. She let the physical evidence speak, the sight of the jagged industrial diagrams clashing with the eco-park posters that surrounded the stage. Evelyn stepped toward Marcus, closing the distance until she could see the fine pores of his skin. The scent of his expensive cologne was an insult against the smell of the ink on her hands. She shoved the heavy folder against his chest, right over his heart. She spoke directly into the microphone, her voice a low, vibrating blade. A gift for the man who has everything, especially the future of this valley. Marcus's hands reflexively snapped up to catch the falling papers, his fingers fumbling with the weight of his own secrets. The crowd went dead silent, watching as the golden boy of Blackwood Creek was forced to cradle the proof of his own betrayal like a dying child. Marcus stood there, trapped by the weight of the paper. He could feel the heat of 1,000 cell phone cameras locking onto the blueprints in his hands. He knew that if he dropped them or tried to hand them off, it would be the final, undeniable proof of his guilt. The camera flashes were a strobe light of judgment. Evelyn watched a single drop of sweat break from his hairline and track down his temple. The public nature of the gift had turned the documents into white-hot coal. He was forced to hold them, to be photographed with them, to own them in front of the very people he had lied to. She turned on her heel and began the long walk down the stairs. The wood groaned under her boots in a town that had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. She didn't look back at Marcus, and she didn't offer a single word of explanation to the crowd. She walked through the throng, and they moved for her as if she were made of glass. She felt the cold air on the back of her neck and the heavy, unasked questions of the townspeople following her like a ghost. She left the lights and the music behind. The only sound, the rhythmic strike of her boots on the pavement, and the lonely cry of a scavenger bird circling the silent square. Back at the Valley Voice, Evelyn didn't bother with the lights. In the gray gloom of the office, she pulled a heavy framing hammer from a drawer. The first blow shattered the plastic casing of the main server, a sharp, satisfying crack. She reached inside and tore the hard drives from their mounts, smashing them against the concrete floor until the platters were nothing but glittering dust. She crushed every thumb drive under her heel and yanked the cables from the walls, surgically erasing the digital soul of the paper. The room smelled of ozone and pulverized circuit boards. She was burning the bridge behind her, ensuring that Marcus could never use her archives to rewrite the history she had spent her life recording. She moved to the layout table where the blank newsprint for the morning edition sat waiting. She didn't touch the computer. She grabbed a thick black marker and, in the bottom corner of the front page, she wrote a single sentence in a small, cramped hand. Silence is all you have left. She left every other page of the edition completely blank. No headlines, no photos, no advertisements. It was a white void, a physical representation of the vacuum she was leaving behind. She stacked the empty papers on the delivery counter where the dawn light would hit them. A final, wordless accusation against a town that had chosen a comfortable lie over a difficult truth. Evelyn walked out of the office and headed toward the city hall. The metal ring of her office keys felt cold and heavy in her palm. With a dull, metallic clink, she dropped them through the brass mail slot of the municipal building. She walked toward her house, her pace steady and unhurried. In her pocket, her phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Marcus's name flashed on the screen over and over, a frantic, electronic heartbeat. She could feel the pulses against her hip, but she never reached for it. The wind kicked up, swirling dead leaves around her ankles as she passed the familiar, crumbling storefronts of her life, ignoring the desperate, dying signals from the man she used to love. In her apartment, the air was still and smelled of lavender soap and old wood. She tossed a battered canvas duffel onto the bed and began throwing in the essentials: a few changes of clothes, her heavy camera, and a small stack of photos from a time before the valley had started to rot. She didn't close the drawers or straighten the rugs. She left her house keys on the kitchen table next to a half-empty cup of tea and walked out the door. She didn't lock it. She left her life open to the elements and the scavengers, descending the stairs without a single backward glance, the walls of the building already feeling like a stranger's house. She climbed into her old sedan, and the engine turned over with a rough, coughing protest before settling into a low hum. She drove past the rusted "Welcome to Blackwood Creek" sign, watching in the rearview mirror as the silhouettes of the factory chimneys and the church spire shrank into gray toothpicks. The smog over the valley was glowing a bruised purple in the fading light. She felt the vibration of the road through the steering wheel, and the cold air from the window began to wash the scent of the print shop out of her hair. The lights of the town flickered once and then vanished behind a curve in the highway, leaving her alone with the hum of the tires and the long, dark ribbon of the interstate. Marcus Reed sat in his office, the silence in the room weighing more than the stone walls of the building. On his desk lay the morning edition of the Valley Voice. The blinding whiteness of the pages seemed to radiate a cold, accusing light. He traced the single sentence in the corner with a trembling finger, the texture of the paper feeling like sandpaper. His power was absolute now, but it was a kingdom of ghosts. Everyone knew what he was, but they were too broken to speak. He realized he was sentenced to play the hero in a play where the audience had already walked out. He gripped the edge of the desk, staring at the blank page until his eyes burned. The sheriff drove his cruiser slowly through the lower settlement, the headlights cutting through the gloom to reveal the new fences and the shadows of the security teams. He pulled up in front of Evelyn's apartment building, the engine ticking as it cooled. He climbed the stairs, his hand resting habitually on his belt. The door to her apartment was ajar, swinging slightly in the draft. He walked through the empty rooms, seeing the keys on the table and the unmade bed. She was gone. No forwarding address, no digital footprint, no trail to follow. He spat on the floor and walked back out to the landing, looking out at the valley and realizing that his authority stopped at the edge of the void she had left behind. Evelyn pulled into a gas station where a blue neon sign hummed and flickered with a dying light. Her fingers, still stained with the lead dust of the Blackwood Creek archives, popped the back off her phone. She pulled the SIM card out, a tiny piece of plastic that held 1,000 connections to a dead life. With a sharp, flicking motion, she tossed it into a trash can overflowing with lottery tickets and empty coffee cups. She climbed back into her car, put it in gear, and drove toward the horizon, the headlights cutting a path through a world that was finally, mercifully quiet.